82 years ago, a young man vanished right inside a wooden house in the middle of the Blue Ridge Forest, disappearing without a trace, leaving his family devastated and the entire Georgia town plunged into obsession. Authorities suspected the woman living with him was involved, but with no body found and too few clues to pursue, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Yet through all those long years, one family member never gave up hope, always believing the truth was still out there somewhere, buried under the passage of time. Then one day, when workers were digging the foundation on the old property, they uncovered an object buried deep, a crucial detail everyone had overlooked, one powerful enough to upend the entire investigation and shock everyone who still remembered this case in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. In the summer of 1943, the town of Blue Ridge in Fannin County, Georgia, was steeped in the quiet rhythm of Southern life amid wartime, where small wooden houses nestled along red dirt roads beneath the dense canopy of the Appalachian Range. The air back then was heavy with caution and scarcity. Young men from the area had gone off to the battlefields, military supply factories ran non-stop, and those left behind lived in a mix of waiting and anxiety. In that setting, Thomas Hale, a young woodworker, returned to Blue Ridge after a late shift. He lived with Evelyn Carter in a small wooden house on the edge of town, where chimney smoke and oil lamplight always flickered through the window frames every evening. The two were seen as a reclusive couple, with little social interaction, and they were almost always spotted together. The evening before Thomas disappeared, a few townspeople saw him with Evelyn walking along the trail leading to their house. The sky was overcast, dark clouds pressing down close to the treetops, a sign of an approaching rainstorm. Thomas stood out in the dim evening light, his coarse cloth jacket speckled with moisture, while Evelyn walked close behind, clutching the hem of her long skirt to avoid the mud. They didn't talk to anyone, just nodded in greeting and hurried inside before the first raindrops fell. That was the last time anyone saw Thomas. The next morning at the lumber mill, where Thomas worked, the manager noticed his absence and that he hadn't requested any time off beforehand. This immediately raised alarm, as Thomas was known for being punctual and had never missed a shift. A relative decided to stop by his house to check. The front door was ajar, the space inside unusually silent. No sign of Thomas, so they called Evelyn down to ask. She replied curtly that Thomas didn't come home after the previous evening, and she thought he might have gone somewhere to avoid the heavy rain. But this answer only heightened the family's worry, because Thomas had never left the house abruptly, let alone vanished overnight. They searched around the property, stepped out to the back porch, walked along the small trail leading into town, but found no sign of him. When the initial search efforts yielded no results, and the family had no indication that Thomas had simply gone somewhere temporarily, they decided to go to the town police station to report him missing. From here, the case officially entered the investigation phase, starting with the Blue Ridge Police Station accepting the report according to the procedures of 1943, a time when Southern law enforcement operated with sparse personnel and all paperwork was done by hand. The local sheriff, more accustomed to handling minor brawls or land disputes than a mysterious disappearance, asked the family to provide full details of what they knew. The information was recorded on forms: Thomas's age, occupation, basic identifying features, along with the time he was last seen the previous evening returning home with Evelyn Carter. When asked, the family confirmed that Thomas had no habit of staying out overnight, let alone disappearing without a word. These details were noted with a higher level of seriousness than usual. Afterward, the sheriff requested Evelyn come in for an initial statement. She repeated that Thomas didn't return home after leaving the house the previous evening, but when pressed for specifics on when he left, she only said vaguely that it was when the rain started, without providing a clear timeline. The sheriff cross-referenced her statement with information from townspeople who said they saw the two enter the house before the heavy rain poured down. This inconsistency wasn't enough to conclude anything, but it was flagged in the file as a detail to note. Thomas's relatives were also questioned about any recent changes in his behavior, his work at the lumber mill, and the relationship between Thomas and Evelyn. All replied that Thomas maintained his normal routine and showed no signs of wanting to leave town or avoid anyone. These records help confirm that Thomas's failure to show up for work that morning was far more unusual than other temporary absences. After completing the initial statement collection, the sheriff moved to independent verification. He went to the lumber mill to confirm Thomas really hadn't shown up. The manager confirmed Thomas never missed a shift without notice. Next, the sheriff returned to the dirt road leading to the Hale Carter house to ask a few nearby residents if they had seen Thomas after the last recorded sighting. All said no. No one saw him leave the house. No one spotted him on the road out to town early that morning. For now, the only verifiable data was that Thomas was seen with Evelyn returning home the evening before the disappearance. With this information, police concluded that the likelihood of Thomas leaving town voluntarily in the rainy night was highly unreasonable. Based on all the statements and initial assessment, the sheriff decided to launch an expanded search around the area of Thomas and Evelyn's house. He mobilized all available resources in Blue Ridge, including a few local police officers, a group of hunters familiar with the mountainous terrain, and some volunteer residents who knew the trails leading to remote areas. This was a typical search team for a small town in 1943, where everyone knew each other and was ready to help when a resident went missing. The search began from the front and backyards of the house where Thomas was last seen. The team split into small groups to cover directions. One group checked the open land behind the house, a second proceeded along the dirt road into town, while another swept the nearby areas where thick bushes and ancient trees could conceal traces of anyone passing through. The hunters focused on observing the ground and grass for footprints, skid marks, or other disturbances, but the heavy rain from before had turned the soil mushy and erased most potential tracking signs. Along the main road, the police group noted that the entire surface only showed traces of rainwater runoff, with no areas unusually compressed, which often appears when someone walks through in a hurry or carrying something heavy. The group sweeping the forest edges also found no broken branches, drag marks, or any natural features affected in a way suggesting an adult man had passed. A few spots looked rough or lightly disturbed, but the hunters determined those were signs of wildlife, mostly deer and black bears, which moved frequently in the area. The lack of any clear signs forced the search radius to expand beyond initial plans. The sheriff directed the entire team farther out from the Hale Carter property into the clearings between low forests and extending toward the trails connecting homes and nearby farms. Along this expanded route, the search participants continued closely observing the ground, grass patches, and paths between tree lines, but results didn't improve. Every path was flattened by rain, every traceable sign washed away by water, and no items belonging to Thomas were left behind. When sweeping to an area about half a mile from Thomas's house, the search team split groups again to cover more ground, extending toward the mountain foothills, where there were slopes and rare flat patches. One group of hunters suggested checking the land near a resident's livestock barn, but the result was the same as elsewhere: absolutely nothing related to the missing person. The entire area around the house, including the main dirt road, small trails, garden, sparse woods, and transition points to the lower residential areas, was swept at least once. By the end of the search, the sheriff compiled all the notes and saw no specific signs indicating which direction Thomas had left the house, causing all hypotheses about external movement to hit a dead end. Precisely because the search around the house yielded no clear results, the sheriff decided to return to Thomas and Evelyn's house for a second, more detailed survey to determine if the interior space revealed signs of what might have happened the evening before Thomas's disappearance. The small wooden house on the edge of town had only two main rooms, a kitchen and a back annex, so the inspection seemed straightforward but required meticulousness because any small disturbance could hold significant meaning in a context with such limited information. The sheriff started in the common living area, which had a dining table, two wooden chairs, and a wall cabinet holding a few household items. The placement of items wasn't in the usual order seen in local families. One of the two chairs was completely out of its familiar spot and facing the wall instead of the table. Next to the chair was a faint scrape on the wooden floor, as if it had been pulled or pushed harder than normal use. The sheriff asked Evelyn why the chair was in that position, but she replied that it might be from cleaning the house, an explanation that wasn't very convincing, because the fresh drag mark and current chair position indicated changes quite close to the inspection time. Near the kitchen entrance, the sheriff noticed an area on the wooden floor that looked darker than surroundings. When shining a flashlight at an angle, he saw it was a surface wiped too clean compared to the rest, creating a slight contrast. Evelyn explained that she mopped the floor last night because of spilled water, but the sheriff saw no signs of water splatter or matching scratches, instead sensing someone had deliberately scrubbed a specific area rather than cleaning the whole, which he noted as inconsistent with normal hygiene behavior. In the kitchen area, some items were also out of place. The dish towel hung crooked to one side. The table had slide marks from a heavy object that had been placed and then lifted, and a gap between two spice jars made the sheriff wonder if something else had been there before. When asked, Evelyn continued saying everything was as usual, only her normal cleaning method kept items from being fixed. This evasive response, lacking specifics, led the sheriff to note that the explanation was vague and didn't clarify the causes of the observed disturbances. In the bedroom, the sheriff saw the blanket folded quite neatly, but the bedsheet edge pulled to one side, a sign the bed had been used hastily or someone sat on the edge briefly. Evelyn said she slept in the bedroom the night of the incident, but the pillow position and blanket wrinkles weren't enough to prove someone had slept there all night. On the bedside table, the sheriff noticed a porcelain cup slightly off the table edge, with no other items around, creating a sense it was placed unnaturally rather than left from the previous evening. In the moment of checking the kitchen utensil cabinet, the sheriff also noticed an empty space where houses like this always had at least one kitchen knife. When asked, Evelyn admitted a large knife got lost somehow, but there were no signs of serious searching in the house. The missing large knife, combined with the floor wiping in the front room, made the entire house condition increasingly suspicious, though the sheriff still couldn't say for sure what had happened. After completing the survey, the sheriff recorded all the disturbance details: off-position chair, localized wiping heavy object slide marks, misaligned bedsheet, unnaturally placed water cup, and a missing kitchen knife, for no clear reason. Though unable to draw a conclusion yet, the sheriff saw these anomalies in the house as completely inconsistent with Evelyn's initial statement of a normal evening, with nothing noteworthy, forcing him to consider surrounding areas for more clues. From that assessment, after thoroughly surveying the interior of the house and noting numerous details that did not match Evelyn's account, the sheriff moved on to examining the back porch area, which could be the direction Thomas left or the site where the incident leading to his disappearance occurred. The back porch is a small patch of ground connecting the kitchen door to the trail leading down to the sparse woods behind the house. The ground surface was heavily affected by the heavy rain on the evening of the disappearance, so observing traces required caution and detailed analysis of the remaining details, even though they were very faint. The sheriff began by directly observing the area right next to the back door. There, he noticed the soft soil had slight indentations, as if someone had stood in place for a short time before the rain partially erased the distinctive marks. The indentations were not deep enough to determine posture or direction, but they were clearly not animal tracks. As he stepped a few paces out onto the porch, he discovered a series of very faint scratch marks on the ground surface, running diagonally to the left, apparently from something scraping against the ground while in motion. These marks were uneven, but had a structure indicating they were not naturally created by rainwater. Based on his investigative experience in the mountainous forest area, the sheriff noted that they could be traces of a heavy object being dragged or pushed while the ground was still dry enough before the heavy rain covered the rest. Extending from the back porch area for about 3 meters, The sheriff observed the soil pushed into uneven small clumps, suggesting significant movement, more than the usual trampling from daily walking. He compared these points to the data recorded from inside the house and saw that the displacement of furniture and the floor could be related to the direction of movement leading to the back porch. Continuing farther, the sheriff observed along the edge of the open ground, connecting the back porch to the trail down to the woods. Here, the traces were even fainter due to the rain's impact, but some small differences could still be seen on the low grass. Some clusters of grass were pressed down in a direction extending from the porch toward the trail, but not in the shape typically seen when a person walks through. Instead, they were flattened horizontally and did not spring back naturally. This led the sheriff to suspect that these were not normal human footsteps, but the result of an object being dragged through the area. Within the open ground, about 5 meters from the house, the sheriff discovered a slightly disturbed oval-shaped area of soil, possibly created by temporarily placing something down before carrying it further. The soil texture showed disturbance that was not too deep, indicating the object placed was not too heavy or was only stopped for a short time. Evelyn mentioned nothing about cleaning, moving large items, or interacting with the back porch area the previous evening. Therefore, these observations led the sheriff to add another contradiction to the file, especially when combined with the unusual signs inside the house. He continued evaluating the direction from the open ground to the trail leading down to the woods. At the forest edge, some low tree trunks had light scratches, as if branches or fabric had brushed against them. Although these marks could be from strong winds during the rainy night, the sheriff assessed that they might be related to the movement of a person or large object. The idea that Thomas could have gone into the woods on his own during the rainy night, without taking any items and without leaving clear footprints, was highly unlikely. Combined with the faint drag marks on the soil and the horizontally pressed grass, the direction toward the woods became the most notable possibility in the entire back porch area. After completing the survey, the sheriff compiled the observations, the indentations near the back door, the scratch marks on the soil, the horizontally pressed grass, and the unusually disturbed soil area, all indicated that the back porch was likely directly related to Thomas's disappearance. The traces were not clear enough to conclude anything definitively, but they were sufficient to point out that, if there was any notable direction of movement, it almost certainly originated from the back of the house rather than the front door or the main road. From this assessment, after noting the faint traces in the back porch area and deciding to expand the search toward the woods, the sheriff moved to the next step in the missing person investigation process, collecting statements from residents living around the Hale Carter house on the night Thomas disappeared. This was an important part, as small towns like Blue Ridge often have connections through neighbors, family, and work, making any nighttime movement by residents likely to be seen or heard by someone, even if only briefly. The sheriff started by visiting the nearest houses around the Hale Carter property, where each family lived in homes spaced from a few dozen to over 100 meters apart. He spoke with an elderly couple living to the east of Thomas's house. They said that the previous night had heavy rain, strong winds, and thunder that made it hard to distinguish strange sounds in the area. However, they remembered that just before the rain fully poured down, they heard what sounded like noise coming from Thomas's house, similar to two people arguing or something lightly bumping, but it lasted only very briefly. Both could not pinpoint the exact time or the content of the sound, and they admitted that what they heard might just be the wind or livestock in the barn. The sheriff recorded everything but marked it with low reliability due to the vagueness in memory and the rain's interference. At another house to the west, a middle-aged woman said she vaguely heard a loud noise or a door slamming hard at some point during the night, but she could not determine where it came from because the sound echoed and strong winds made the direction unclear. She also did not see any lights or movement on the dirt road leading to the Hale Carter property. When asked further, she said she did not hear footsteps passing through her yard, which led the sheriff to note that if Thomas had left the house via the main dirt road, she might have heard or seen something, but she had no such records. To the south, a man living near a small field said he was in the livestock barn that evening and heard something like a loud call, but due to the distance and the rain starting to pour, he was not sure if it was a human voice or wild animal noise. He clearly stated he could not tell if the sound came from Thomas's house or the woods behind. These statements continued to be marked as lacking authenticity, as they provided no solid data on time, sound direction, or the number of people involved in the sounds heard. Near the end of the statement collection, the sheriff visited a young family living diagonally to the north of Thomas's house. They said they went to bed early and heard nothing but the rain. They also did not see any unusual lights, hear footsteps, or notice any notable movement around their property. Thus, compiling the statements from all four directions surrounding the house showed the presence of unusual sounds before the heavy rain, but no statement was consistent or clear enough to determine the nature of the sound, its origin, or the specific time. Those who heard sounds could not provide detailed descriptions, while others heard or saw nothing unusual. All statements were affected by weather conditions, the distance between houses, and the sloping terrain that distorted sounds. More importantly, no statement helped determine whether Thomas left the house or not, or if so, in which direction. No one saw him on the dirt road leading to town, nor did anyone see him near the forest edge. This made it harder for the sheriff to conclude whether Thomas left the house voluntarily or if the disappearance occurred entirely out of sight. In the report, the sheriff noted that the residents' statements only indicated signs of unusual sounds on the night before Thomas disappeared, but their vagueness was not enough to establish any specific investigative direction. The inconsistency in statements and the lack of direct witnesses seeing Thomas move after the last time he was seen with Evelyn made all community data merely referential, not evidence to guide the way. From these factors, the sheriff concluded that there was no data determining Thomas's direction of movement after returning home with Evelyn, and the disappearance remained in a state lacking key information to clearly shape the events of that rainy night. After completing the collection of statements from residents in the area and reviewing the records from the outdoor search as well as the interior survey of Thomas and Evelyn's house, the sheriff took time to compile all available data to systematically assess the level of abnormality in the disappearance. The first data brought into comparison were the field observations at the back porch and open ground. The slight indentations near the back door, the faint drag scratches, the horizontally pressed grass sections, and the small disturbed soil area. All were not clear enough to be considered direct evidence, but they aligned with the direction leading to the woods, where Thomas might have passed or been taken through. The sheriff noted that these traces, though faint, still showed the presence of force applied in the direction out the back of the house rather than toward the front road. In a small town, this difference was significant because it ruled out the possibility that Thomas left the house through the front to go somewhere voluntarily. In parallel, the sheriff reviewed all statements from those living nearby, including those hearing unusual sounds before the rain. Although the statements lacked consistency, they all implicitly indicated that some kind of noise occurred around Thomas's house, noise that no one could identify but existed within the same time frame. However, all statements were limited by weather factors, thunder, and terrain structure that distorted sounds. These factors made the collected data referential only, unusable for building a specific hypothesis. Comparing with the interior house data, the sheriff noted the disturbance signs: a chair displaced from its position, localized wiping on the floor, kitchen items not in their natural state, and a large knife missing from the drawer. These details did not match Evelyn's account of an evening with nothing unusual. However, at this point, they were still not enough to prove that a violent incident or crime occurred in the house. The sheriff also had to consider that many families in the area regularly cleaned, moved furniture, or rearranged items in their own way, especially in older homes, so some details not fully aligning with the account could not yet be seen as evidence of criminal behavior. Next, the sheriff evaluated the possibility that Thomas left the house voluntarily. From family and sawmill owner statements, Thomas was disciplined in his work, showed no signs of wanting to leave town or dissatisfaction with anyone. He had no history of running away, no distant acquaintances, and no personal means of transportation. If Thomas wanted to go anywhere, he would have to walk. But walking far on a heavy rainy night, without being seen, was highly unlikely. Moreover, the only road leading to town was within view of several households, and none reported seeing Thomas that evening or the next morning. Thus, the possibility of voluntary departure was nearly eliminated. The sheriff also considered the possibility of a spontaneous accident, such as slipping and falling near the house, falling into a hole, or injury from impact. However, the search team had scoured the entire open ground, trail, and forest edge near the house, but found no signs of a fall, no bloodstains, no torn clothing, and no items belonging to Thomas. This left the accident hypothesis without basis to pursue further. Another possibility was that Thomas entered the woods, but got lost or encountered danger. But if that happened, the search team should have found at least minimal traces in the forest direction: footprints, fabric scraps, broken branches, or any dropped items. Meanwhile, all natural traces were washed away by the rain to the point of indistinguishability, and no discoveries allowed determination of whether Thomas ever entered the woods. After eliminating accident, voluntary departure, and other common scenarios, the sheriff concluded that the case showed signs of abnormality, but not enough to escalate to a criminal case. The suspicious elements, the faint traces at the back porch, disturbances in the house, Evelyn's inconsistent statements, and the vague noises during the rainy night, all created a framework of suspicion, but lacked direct elements to confirm criminal activity. No one saw Thomas after the last time he returned home, but no one saw clear signs of violence either. In the interim report, the sheriff clearly stated that the disappearance does not fit voluntary departure or natural accident, but also emphasized that there is no specific evidence proving a crime. After synthesizing the available data, and noting that Evelyn's initial statement lacked sufficient detail to explain the traces and disturbances in the house, the sheriff decided to conduct a formal interrogation to gather a more complete statement, while also verifying whether the information Evelyn provided matched the on-site observation. Since this was still the missing person investigation phase, not a criminal interrogation, the session was conducted at the police station following standard procedures, with the primary goal of clarifying the sequence of events the evening before Thomas disappeared and the details related to the last moment. The two were in the house together. Evelyn stated that on that evening, Thomas returned home late, but showed no unusual sign. When asked about the time Thomas left the house, Evelyn said she didn't remember exactly, but repeated that he might have stepped out when it started raining. The sheriff cross-referenced this with witness statements from residents who said they saw Thomas return home with Evelyn before the heavy rain began, and that no one saw him leave afterward. When reminded of this, Evelyn claimed Thomas might have gone out the back door, but she couldn't explain why he would do so instead of using the front door as was his usual habit. One point the sheriff noted was Evelyn describing Thomas as seeming anxious before disappearing, but when asked specifically what he was anxious about, she couldn't provide clear details, only saying maybe about work. This contradicted statements from family members and the wood mill manager, who affirmed that Thomas had stable work and no negative pressures recently. The sheriff continued questioning about activities in the house that evening. Evelyn said they had no arguments and everything was normal, but when asked about the reason items in the living room were out of place, she said she cleaned the house haphazardly before going to bed. However, when the sheriff asked why only a few spots were thoroughly wiped, while most of the floor showed no signs of cleaning, Evelyn replied that she didn't clearly remember where she wiped, an answer inconsistent with her previous description. When asked about the large knife missing from the kitchen knife block, Evelyn said she might have put it somewhere and forgotten, but the sheriff noted that the knife block was neatly arranged with no signs of searching. Cross-referencing this with the localized wiping on the front room floor, he found Evelyn's explanations disjointed and unable to provide a reasonable answer for the causes of these two anomalies. The sheriff also asked Evelyn about the sounds residents heard before the heavy rain. Evelyn denied any unusual noises in the house and said maybe they mistook it for wind sounds. But what caught the sheriff's attention was that when mentioning the timing of the sounds heard by residents, Evelyn's response differed from her initial statement when she said she went to bed early and didn't know what happened after that. This contradicted her earlier description of Thomas leaving when the rain started, meaning she must have been awake at that time. When questioned again about this detail, Evelyn only said she didn't remember clearly, and that evening everything happened quickly. This contradiction was noted as an anomaly to monitor since it directly related to a critical timeline in the disappearance. Throughout the interrogation, the sheriff observed that Evelyn often answered vaguely, avoiding specific details and frequently using phrases like, "don't remember clearly, maybe, or probably like that." Although the sheriff lacked sufficient grounds to conclude Evelyn was deliberately concealing something, the minor inconsistencies between her statements and the collected data were beginning to form a chain of anomalies requiring expanded verification beyond the house's scope. For this reason, after concluding the first interrogation and noting the notable discrepancies in Evelyn's account, the sheriff decided to continue expanding the search to the natural areas around Thomas's house, in line with the locations the search team had proposed during the initial sweep. One of the mentioned sites was the old stone well located at the edge of the sparse woods behind the house, which had been abandoned for many years and now only had a low stone mouth roughly stacked, covered in moss and decayed leaves. This well was once used by locals decades ago, but after other water sources were developed, it fell into disuse, becoming part of the forgotten natural landscape. In the current context, surveying the stone well became a necessary step, even if only for elimination purposes. The sheriff, along with 2 search team members, brought ropes, iron hooks, and a handheld flashlight to the well's mouth area. The well's location was about more than 200 meters from Thomas's house, far enough that no one from the house could see it, but close enough for a person to reach in a short time. The area around the well was overgrown with low bushes, and the ground underfoot was soft due to the heavy rain on the night of the disappearance. The sheriff found no clear footprints, which was entirely understandable, since all surface traces had been washed away by the rain, leaving muddy and slippery ground. Upon reaching the well's mouth, the sheriff observed the surrounding stones and saw they were covered in thick moss, with no signs of recent disturbance. The stones had no skid marks, no fresh dirt adhering to the stone faces, and the dry leaves around the mouth were not displaced excessively. This led the sheriff to note that if any activity had occurred around the well on the night Thomas disappeared, the traces had been distorted or completely erased by the rain. To inspect inside the well, one search team member tied an iron hook to the end of the rope and lowered it down. They pulled it up and down multiple times to see if the hook caught on anything unusual at the bottom, but each time it came up only with mud, decayed leaves, and a few small pebbles. The well's bottom appeared to have silted up over years of disuse, making it difficult to retrieve large objects. But the lightness of the pull indicated no obstruction equivalent to the weight of a human body or large item. Afterward, the sheriff used the handheld flashlight to shine down the well. The faint light reflected off the damp stone walls covered in moss, but revealed no clear objects. The water pooled at the bottom was shallow, just a thin layer, with no signs of bubbles, thin mud, or swirl marks, indicating a large object had fallen in. All they saw was the layer of decayed leaves, a few pebbles, and thick mud, entirely consistent with the state of a long-abandoned well. For further assurance, the sheriff requested lowering the hook once more to the left side of the well, then to the right, but the results remained the same. There was no sensation of the hook hitting anything solid, nothing heavy or unusual pulled up. The inspection time extended a few more minutes to ensure no area within the equipment's reach was missed, but the stone well's silence and the hook's feedback did not change. After checking the interior, the sheriff re-examined the surrounding area one last time. No freshly broken branches, no drag or skid marks on the ground, and no scattered personal items. He noted that the lack of any signs around the well did not mean eliminating all related possibilities, but it meant the stone well could not be considered a point of interest in the current search phase. In his report, the sheriff concluded that the old stone well provided no useful signs and temporarily played no significant role in determining where Thomas went or what happened on the night he disappeared. With one point of suspicion eliminated, the sheriff turned attention back to the woods behind the Hale-Purter house, where the faint traces on the back porch remained the only clue suggesting Thomas might have left the house or been taken from there. With this assessment, the search team was mobilized to expand operations into the forest section adjacent to the Chattahoochee, which stretched into a dense area with multiple layers of bushes, gentle slopes, and uneven terrain. This was a vast natural area, and a person entering the woods at night could completely vanish into the shadows without detection. However, searching the forest at this time was extremely difficult, as the heavy rain on the night of the disappearance had erased nearly all footprints, skid marks, or mechanical traces on the surface ground. The search team divided into 3 small groups to sweep 3 different directions. One group advanced into the forest along the natural trail starting from behind Thomas's property. The second group headed northeast, where the forest floor was flatter, and the third group moved in a curved path to the west to cover as much terrain as possible. The hunters on the team, who understood even the smallest environmental changes in the woods, led the way to increase the chances of detecting anomalies. After advancing a few hundred meters into the forest, the first group observed the ground, but saw only soaked fallen leaves clinging in thick patches, with no remaining indentations that could indicate someone had passed near the time the rain started. The low tree trunks and bushes also showed no signs of being forcefully pushed aside, a common occurrence if someone rushed through in the dark. This led the sheriff to note that if Thomas had entered this area, most traces could have been completely obscured by the rain. The second group, moving in the flatter land, focused on areas that might retain minimal traces, such as mud patches not fully washed away, low spots with standing water, or areas around large tree roots. However, the results were still unpromising. Every location had been wiped clean of signs, with the ground surface flattened by rain and water flowing down the slopes, leaving only smooth mud and decayed leaves, with no significant disturbance. The third group, moving deeper to the west, where the terrain was more complex with many fallen branches and rocky areas, still found no direct evidence. They only discovered signs of animal activity, such as deer tracks, black bear claw marks on tree trunks, and wild boar digging marks. These natural traces varied in age, but none were clear or large enough to be considered related to an adult's disappearance. As the search team ventured farther into the forest, the sheriff instructed everyone to stop at certain points to listen for sounds in the area, in case the victim was injured and unable to move. However, besides the dripping water from the canopy and light wind, there were no sounds indicating human presence. For added certainty, one team member blew a signal whistle, but there was no response from afar. The sheriff noted that the absence of cries for help could not be conclusive evidence, as if Thomas were severely injured or unconscious, he couldn't make sounds himself. However, the lack of response from any direction also significantly reduced the likelihood of finding the victim alive in the forest. In addition to direct search efforts, the team marked the points they had passed and cross-referenced them with the area map to ensure no routes were missed. They scanned from sparse forest sections to densely wooded areas, from ground hollows to reed patches, but still found no personal items, fabric scraps, or signs that could help confirm Thomas's presence. After many hours of searching in wet forest conditions, overcast skies, and hard-to-observe ground, the sheriff summarized the session and noted that the Chattahoochee forest within close radius of Thomas's house showed absolutely no noteworthy traces. This result provided no new clues and did not clarify whether Thomas had entered the forest, leaving the determination of his movement direction in continued deadlock. In the end-of-day report, the sheriff clearly stated that the entire nearest forest area to the house had been swept but recorded no signs of the victim, and that searching under weather-affected conditions had significantly reduced the ability to gather information. 3 months have passed since the day Thomas Hale was reported missing, and all the search and investigation efforts by local forces have still not yielded any signs or information that could bring them closer to determining what happened on that rainy night. Extensive searches, from the house, dirt roads, back porch, forest edge, to deep inside the Chattahoochee Forest, all ended with the same conclusion: not a single viable trace remained. Bad weather, complex terrain, and the limitations of investigative tools in 1943 meant that even the faintest clues were wiped out before the search team could reach them. Every initially promising lead successively hit a dead end. No witnesses saw Thomas leave the house, no one saw him appear in any public areas after that final evening, and testimonies about unusual sounds were too vague to establish an accurate timeline or context. The surface traces on the back porch and open lot, once considered the only guide to Thomas's possible movements, also failed to develop into any solid chain of reasoning because they lacked connection to other data. The disturbances inside the house, misaligned chairs, localized floor wiping marks, items out of place, a missing kitchen knife, were recorded in the file as unusual details. But none were strong enough to constitute criminal evidence. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no serious damage inside the house, and no direct physical evidence linked to violent behavior. Although these factors prevented the sheriff from completely ruling out the possibility of an incident inside the house, he also could not rely on them to reach any official conclusion. As for Evelyn, the only interrogation during this period showed that her statement had minor inconsistencies, but the level of inconsistency was not enough to shift the investigation toward a criminal possibility. She answered evasively, inconsistently about timings, but showed no signs of stress or avoidance sufficient to create a legal basis for continuing interrogation in a more serious direction. Additionally, no witnesses heard clear screams or arguments, and there was no physical evidence connecting Evelyn to Thomas's disappearance in a negative way. Faced with a complete lack of new data, the sheriff had to confront the reality that the investigative force had exhausted every possible avenue within the available time, personnel, and tools. Thomas's family, though still persistently hoping to find clues, gradually realized that continuing to expand the search would not yield clear benefits due to the vast mountains and forests, rapidly changing weather, and the lack of natural barriers, causing any traces to disappear in just a few days. In the final internal meeting before making the decision, the sheriff reviewed the entire file, including scene reports, search records, civilian testimonies, the missing person report, and preliminary conclusions noted over the 3 months. The overall conclusion was: no data proving Thomas left the house in any direction voluntarily, no data proving he had an accident, no data proving criminal activity inside the house, and no data proving third-party involvement. Therefore, under the enforcement standards of 1943, the case could not be upgraded to a criminal investigation and had to be classified as a missing person with unknown cause. The sheriff completed the file, marking the case as one of the missing person incidents with no progress, while filing all records, reports, and notes into the county's long-term storage, where unresolved cases are kept and only revisited upon new information. As he closed the file, he noted, "This case still has many inconsistencies, but there is no physical evidence to go further." With that decision, Thomas Hale's disappearance was officially added to the cold case list, closing the initial investigation phase in the heavy silence of the town of Blue Ridge. Nearly 6 decades have passed since Thomas Hale's missing person file was placed in long-term storage, and the town of Blue Ridge has changed significantly. The population has grown. Abandoned lots have gradually been replaced by new homes, and old stories are only mentioned in the memories of the elderly. Until 2000, when a residential construction project began near the land where Thomas and Evelyn's house once stood, an unexpected discovery suddenly brought the forgotten 57-year-old disappearance back into the light. The construction crew was excavating the foundation for a new house when they encountered an obstruction deep beneath the hard soil layer. At first, they thought it was a large rock or piece of old concrete, but as they continued digging, they realized the object was rectangular and made a hollow sound when tools struck it. After using a crowbar to separate the surrounding soil, they pulled up an old metal box, its surface rusted, edges chipped, and lid jammed by years of accumulated damp earth. The box's shape indicated it had been buried intentionally, not something randomly buried over time. Sensing it might contain forgotten personal belongings, the site supervisor ordered the box opened for inspection before reporting to the investor. When prying open the lid, the group was surprised to find inside not construction materials or household items, but 3 objects wrapped in rotted cloth. The fabric tore apart at the touch, revealing the contents beneath: an old military-style folding knife, a dark-colored handkerchief with embroidery patterns so faded they were nearly illegible, and a completely broken men's wristwatch that still retained its metal frame. Although time had deformed these items, their shapes and materials were enough for the workers to realize they were not buried accidentally. In particular, the folding knife with its rusted steel blade made them suspect whether this was related to something more serious. After a few minutes of consideration, the supervisor decided not to touch the box further and immediately called the local police. At that time, the Blue Ridge Police had a much more professional system than in 1943. An officer was dispatched to the scene, recorded the box's position, sealed the excavation area, and seized the metal box according to evidence handling procedures. Upon preliminary examination 38 examination of the items inside, the officer noted that the folding knife resembled those used by the military during World War II, and the handkerchief had embroidered marks that could be handwritten initials or someone's name. This led him to suspect that the evidence might be related to an old case. After bringing the box back to the station, authorities decided to check the archives to determine if the discovery site had ever been linked to any past records. Thanks to the location marked on the construction map, police quickly realized that the spot where the box was found was right next to the Hale Carter house lot, the site of the 1943 disappearance. The fact that a metal box was buried deep in the ground in that area, containing a man's personal items and something resembling a weapon, was immediately seen as an event potentially directly related to Thomas Hale's long-term missing person case. From there, police reported the discovery to superiors and officially decided to reopen the file, bringing the case back under investigation as a cold case with new evidence, creating a major breakthrough after decades of stalemate. After the missing person file of Thomas Hale was officially reopened due to the discovery of the metal box at the construction site, the Blue Ridge Police transferred all the collected evidence to the county's forensic laboratory for analysis using 2000-era techniques, which were far more advanced than anything the investigative team could access in 1943. Although time had degraded many details on the items, the forensic team was still able to maximize the remaining traces to determine whether these objects were directly related to the disappearance that had been closed for 57 years. The first piece of evidence examined was the military folding knife. The blade was rusted, but the basic structure remained intact. On the hinge part, there was a faint engraving of the manufacturing year from the World War II period, matching the type of knife issued to some military units and also purchased by civilians after the war. Despite rust covering most of the blade surface, the technicians used special light illumination methods to check for signs of blood or soft tissue trapped in it. Some darker rust patches than usual were carefully separated for chemical testing, and preliminary results showed the presence of oxidized iron along with decomposed proteins, indicators that the blade had once come into contact with human blood, though the long time had severely denatured the sample. Recognizing the potential link to injury, the lab shifted to examining the dark-colored handkerchief. The soft handkerchief was nearly rotted, but the edge still retained a section embroidered with white thread that had faded. Under magnification, the embroidered characters looked like H-E, depending on how the frayed threads were read. This was a particularly important detail, as according to the old file, Thomas Hale often used handkerchiefs embroidered with the initial of his name, the type sold at a small embroidery shop in town during wartime. The remaining fabric strip was also sent for testing. When the fabric sample was soaked in an enzyme recovery solution, the technician noticed some dark brown patches still deeply embedded in the fibers. The sample was separated for modern qualitative human blood testing, and the reaction was positive. More importantly, although the DNA was severely degraded, some short segments were sufficient for limited analysis using simple STR techniques. Comparison with voluntary DNA samples provided by Hale family descendants showed significant genetic correlation, enough to determine that the blood on the handkerchief very likely belonged to someone of the same bloodline as the Hale family, thereby indicating that the handkerchief was highly likely Thomas's, or at least had direct contact with him. The third piece of evidence was the damaged men's wristwatch. The entire glass face was shattered. The hands had fallen off the pivot, but the metal body and strap were still intact. This was a common watch style from the 1940s, however the metal back still retained a few small engravings. When cleaned with a mild solution, the engravings became clearer. 3 faint characters resembling TH or T.Ha, matching Thomas Hale's initials as per many documents in the original file. Although absolute confirmation was impossible, police assessed this as strong linking evidence because Thomas was confirmed by family to regularly wear a watch engraved with his name before disappearing. By cross-referencing the watch's shape and size with the description in the 1943 file, the forensic experts concluded a very high match probability. After analyzing each piece of evidence separately, the lab compiled all results. The knife showed traces indicating contact with human blood, the handkerchief bore genetic markers matching the Hale family, and the watch had engravings consistent with the victim's name. The fact that all 3 items were found together in a metal box buried deep underground near the Hale-Carter property area made the hypothesis of connection to Thomas's disappearance clearer than ever. When the complete forensic report was submitted, the investigating officers concluded that the nature of the evidence and the discovery location indicated this could not be a randomly discarded box. All evidence pointed to the same conclusion: this set of items had a direct link to the victim in the 1943 disappearance case. More importantly, the folding knife bearing suspected injury marks led police to assess that the case was no longer simply a missing person with unknown cause. Although the initial file lacked evidence to open a criminal case, the 2000 data changed the case's nature, opening the possibility of considering violent acts at the time Thomas disappeared. Thanks to the combination of modern forensic technology and the evidence discovery location, police affirmed that the metal box was decisive and could provide the answer to a disappearance that the previous generation could not resolve. This was the key basis for them to determine that the evidence matched the 1943 disappearance case and served as the foundation for proceeding with further investigative steps. After the forensic results showed a direct connection to Thomas Hale, police decided to re-evaluate all areas searched in 1943, especially those capable of concealing objects but previously excluded due to the limitations of equipment at that time. Among the sites to be re-scanned, the ancient stone well behind the Hale-Carter property became the top priority. In 1943, the search team could only inspect the well using rope, iron hooks, and ordinary flashlights, making depth assessment and objects inside entirely dependent on light reflection and the feel of pulling the rope. But by 2000, with modern equipment support, the stone well could be fully surveyed according to new forensic standards. When the investigation team returned to the well site, the surrounding landscape had changed somewhat. Bushes grew taller, the layer of decayed leaves was thicker, and the stone surface around the well mouth was more weathered, but the basic well structure remained intact. Police used GPR equipment to scan from the well mouth downward. GPR generated images of feedback from soil layers and objects below using electromagnetic waves, allowing detection of whether any anomalies were deep under the mud and decayed leaves. The results displayed on the screen showed an abnormal signal area at the well bottom, a feedback shape with higher material density than the surrounding mud, located offset to the left side of the well shaft, about a few dozen centimeters from the measured bottom. This shape was not uniform and not flat, suggesting the presence of a medium-sized object covered by multiple sediment layers. This was something the 1943 search team could not detect because the iron hook at that time might have touched mud, decayed leaves, or tree roots without creating a distinctly different sensation. To reinforce the GPR results, police additionally used high-power penetration lights capable of piercing through murky mud to reflect hard object edges if they were near the surface. The strong light created a faint reflection streak in the left corner of the well bottom, not clear enough to determine specific shape, but sufficient to confirm the existence of an object not matching the color or structure of stone, mud, or rotted wood. Having two technological indicators pointing to the same spot made police suspect that the stone well, previously excluded due to lack of analytical technology, might actually be where something significant occurred. The investigators re-examined the stone surface around the well mouth, this time using contact detection powder and angled lighting. On some points, they found a few small abrasion marks, very faint due to time weathering, but their structure did not match natural causes. Although time had worn these marks to the point where the cause could not be confirmed, they were still recorded because they were located exactly on the left side of the well mouth, matching the area where radar detected the anomaly below. The investigators' analysis indicated that if a large object had fallen into the well decades ago, mud and decayed leaves would gradually cover it season by season, but the object would still produce a different feedback when scanned with GPR, just like the current data recorded. A forensic technician also noted that the well was an ideal place for long-term concealment because natural decomposition occurred quickly. Odors were contained under layers of soil and stone, and it was hard to detect with manual methods, completely aligning with the limitations of the 1943 search. After compiling all new findings, police prepared an internal report stating clearly the ancient stone well, previously removed from the suspect list due to crude survey results, now showed clear evidence of an abnormal object below. Although it could not be identified without direct access, the consistent signals from GPR and penetration light were strong enough to reach a preliminary conclusion that the stone well needed to be excavated according to forensic procedures. The excavation proposal was sent to county management, accompanied by analysis of the potential link between the object and the 1943 disappearance based on the new evidence discovery location at the construction site and the match between field data. With survey results clearer than ever, police determined that the ancient stone well was no longer just an exclusion site but had become a central location requiring direct investigation in the next step. When the forensic evidence results and data from resurveying the ancient stone well both strongly indicated that Thomas Hale's disappearance was not merely a voluntary vanishing, police decided to summon Evelyn Carter for a second interrogation, this time under modern investigative standards, with the goal of obtaining a comprehensive statement and checking consistency between what she had said in 1943 and the evidence emerging in 2000. Evelyn, then over 80 years old, living in a small town a few hours' drive from Blue Ridge, was invited to the Fannin County Sheriff's Station in a context where investigators already had much new data to cross-reference. No longer relying on vague memory or general questions like in the 1943 investigation phase, the officers this time focused on key points: the timeline of the evening before Thomas disappeared, the psychological state of both, their relationship, activities in the house that evening, and especially details related to the folding knife, handkerchief, watch, and the ancient stone well location. From the start of the interrogation, Evelyn appeared cautious and guarded when recalling old events. She said that too much time had passed for memories to remain clear, but she still emphasized that Thomas had left the house that evening and did not return. When asked to describe exactly the moment Thomas left, Evelyn said he went out when it started raining, but this was the first contradiction with her 1943 statement, when she had said she went to bed before knowing Thomas left the house. The investigator pointed out this inconsistency and asked Evelyn to explain, but she only said she didn't remember the exact time. However, the investigator noted that this vagueness did not match the level of detail she had recalled in the initial interrogation nearly 6 decades earlier. When moving to questions about the evidence, the investigators presented the handkerchief with the faint embroidered characters found in the metal box. Evelyn looked at the handkerchief for a long time and said it might be something Thomas had like that, but did not confirm it was his. The investigator reminded her that in 1943, Thomas's family had stated he always carried a handkerchief embroidered with his name initial, and the characters on the handkerchief fully matched the old description. Evelyn's hesitation at this point was noted, especially since she could not provide a reason why a handkerchief with blood from the same genetic line as the Hale family was in a metal box buried near where Thomas lived. When asked about the watch, Evelyn firmly stated she had never seen that watch before, but this statement contradicted 1943 accounts from Thomas's relatives that he often wore a watch engraved with his name. The investigator did not disclose the engraving details to avoid leading, but asked Evelyn to describe whether Thomas owned a watch. Evelyn replied that Thomas had a few small personal items, but could not explain why the metal box buried just a few meters from her property contained men's items matching the description of Thomas's possessions. When cross-referencing the evening of the disappearance, the investigator asked again about the state of items in the house. In 1943, Evelyn said, "Everything was normal," but in 2000, when reminded about the misplaced chair, localized wiping marks on the floor, and the missing kitchen knife, Evelyn said, "Maybe I cleaned up or dropped something." This created a new chain of contradictions. Why in 1943 did she say nothing happened, but in 2000 admit possibly spilling or cleaning? This change led the investigator to note that the current statement was no longer compatible with the original data. Next, the investigator asked directly about the military folding knife found with the handkerchief and watch. In 1943, Evelyn had told the sheriff that no sharp objects were missing from the house, but in 2000, when asked if she had ever seen Thomas holding or owning a folding knife, she replied not sure. The difference between no and not sure was marked as a significant contradiction, especially since the knife with blood traces had been forensically identified as key evidence. The pivotal point in the interrogation was when the investigator asked Evelyn about the stone well behind the house, where in 1943 she said she never went near because of fear of slipping. But when asked again in 2000, Evelyn said she didn't remember clearly if she had ever gone to that area with Thomas or not. When the investigator reminded her that in 1943 she had stated very firmly that she never went out behind the woods in the evening, Evelyn replied that maybe she didn't intend to remember too much detail. This created a new contradiction, the shift from a strong denial to an uncertain response. Throughout the interrogation, the investigator noted that Evelyn consistently gave vague answers, avoided confirming clear details, and frequently used phrases like, "don't remember," "maybe," "I'm not sure." Compared to the 1943 statement, which though brief affirmed many specific details, the 2000 statement was looser and less logical. This difference became the focal point, leading the investigator to assess that Evelyn was altering her account in a way that reflected her new awareness of the presented evidence. At the end of the interrogation, the report clearly stated that there were significant contradictions between the 1943 and 2000 statements, particularly regarding the time Thomas left the house, the state of items in the house, the presence of sharp objects, and the range of movement around the stone well. Although Evelyn did not admit anything wrong, the increasing level of inconsistency led the investigator to conclude that her statement was no longer reliable, and the new evidence had opened greater suspicion about her role in the disappearance. After completing the second interrogation session with Evelyn and noting a series of new inconsistencies, the investigative agency proceeded with a comprehensive analysis step to cross-reference all documents, statements, and scene reports, spanning nearly 6 decades from when Thomas Hale's disappearance was reported in 1943 until the reinvestigation in 2000. This cross-referencing aimed not only to clarify the contradictory points, but also to identify areas of information that had been concealed, statements adjusted over time, and elements reinforced by new physical evidence. First, the investigators reorganized the entire case file in precise chronological order. The family's initial missing person report, Evelyn's first statement, the 1943 home survey record, the back porch sweep report, the forest search map, reports on civilian witness accounts, notes from the first interrogation, then all forensic examination results along with the 2000 GPR report and Evelyn's latest statement. When categorizing the information into groups, time, location, behavior, items, sounds, and reactions, the investigators quickly noticed several irreconcilable points between Evelyn's accounts at the two different times. For example, in 1943, Evelyn stated that she went to bed before Thomas left the house, but in 2000 she said that Thomas went outside when it was raining, meaning she was still awake at that time. This was not just a minor contradiction, but one that reversed the sequence of events at a critical moment in the disappearance. In the Household Activity Data Group, the 1943 report recorded Evelyn saying, "Nothing happened that evening," while the physical signs, chair strongly displaced, localized wiping marks on the floor, shifted items, were not reflected at all in her statement. In 2000, when confronted with questions about these disturbances, Evelyn provided entirely different vague explanations, such as, "Maybe I dropped something," or "I cleaned the house before going to bed," completely contrary to her initial statement that the evening was nothing unusual. These changes indicated a decreasing level of consistency in her statements over time, with the shifts concentrating on points where new physical evidence applied pressure. In the items data group, the biggest contradiction involved the handkerchief and watch. In 1943, Evelyn mentioned nothing about Thomas's personal items being missing, but in 2000, when shown the handkerchief embroidered with initials matching Thomas's name, she said, "He might have had one like that." This raised the question, if she had known Thomas owned a handkerchief or watch, why did that not appear in the initial statement? Conversely, if she did not know or recognize his items, why respond in a way that avoided confirmation rather than outright denial? In the Sharp Objects Data Group, in 1943 Evelyn said, no sharp items were missing from the house, but in 2000, she said she was not sure if Thomas owned a folding knife or not. When combining this data with a military folding knife, with blood traces, found in the metal box buried near the old house foundation, the investigators concluded that the change in statement reflected a trend of evasion, withholding information that could link to the evidence. In the location data group, the most prominent contradiction related to the stone well. In 1943, Evelyn stated that she never went near the well because she was afraid of slipping, but in 2000, she said she did not remember clearly whether she had ever been there or gone with Thomas or not. The difference between a firm denial and an open-ended response showed Evelyn adjusting her statement to reduce certainty, a sign the investigators assessed as deliberate to avoid being bound by responsibility. After cross-referencing all data and creating an exclusion linkage analysis, the investigators realized that each small contradiction, when standing alone, could be attributed to memory decline, the long passage of time, or ambiguity in the interrogation circumstances. However, when placed all together, the discrepancy between the 1943 and 2000 accounts formed a link chain clearly showing a trend. The more new data emerged, the more Evelyn's statements changed to better fit avoiding responsibility or limiting her degree of involvement with the evidence found near the old house foundation. This was assessed as a primary manifestation of information concealment behavior. The analysis report concluded that the contradictions were not merely the result of diminished memory, but had a structural tendency to reduce the direct connection between Evelyn and the moment Thomas disappeared. Through cross-referencing all documents over nearly 6 decades, the investigative agency determined that the level of inconsistency in the statements had exceeded the threshold that could be considered normal error and began to become a suspicious sign, sufficient to consider the next action step in the process of clarifying the 1943 disappearance. After the 1943, 2000 cross-analysis clarified the key contradictions and showed that Evelyn's statements had a tendency to change in the direction of avoiding responsibility. The investigation team decided to conduct a final confrontation session in which all physical evidence, forensic results, and data from the ancient stone well would be presented directly to Evelyn to test her reactions and assess whether she would maintain her statements or provide new information. The session was arranged discreetly, with the presence of 2 investigators, a legal staff member, and a minute-taker. To begin, the investigator presented the folding knife forensic results again. The blade had traces of human blood. The dried blood sample on the handkerchief genetically matched the Hale family, and the watch was engraved with initials matching Thomas's name. Evelyn remained silent for most of the time, only saying short phrases like, "I don't remember, I'm not sure," when asked if she knew these items. When the investigator placed the metal box on the table and asked why it was buried deep near the foundation of the house where she once lived, Evelyn looked down and said that she didn't know who did that. However, a marked change in her expression and voice showed she had been affected by the new information, especially when the investigator explained that the metal box was buried in a position where no one could accidentally drop or misbury it. The next step in the confrontation was presenting the data from the stone well GPR survey. The investigator showed radar scan images displaying an abnormal signal area at the bottom of the well, explaining that the response structure indicated a medium-sized object buried under layers of mud over time. Upon hearing about the stone well, Evelyn began to show clearer signs of confusion. She gripped the armrests of the chair, her eyes constantly shifting, and her responses became fragmented. The investigator asked again about her 1943 statement when she affirmed she had never gone near the well, then cross-referenced it with her 2000 statement when she said not remember clearly. This change was placed on the table, along with the data showing an anomaly beneath the well. Finally, the investigator asked directly, "Was there something that happened at the stone well on the night Thomas disappeared that you haven't said?" That moment stretched in silence. Evelyn breathed heavily, looking down at her trembling hands. After a long while, as if the silence left her no way out, she said softly, her voice faltering, that there was a struggle that night. When asked to explain more clearly, Evelyn admitted that she and Thomas had a violent argument in the house on the evening he disappeared. She said that Thomas had been drinking and became uncontrollable, while she was terrified, especially when he touched some objects, causing them to fall or shift, which matched the state of the furniture that police recorded in 1943. Evelyn recounted that during the struggle, Thomas was injured. She did not describe clearly with what, but the appearance of the folding knife in the metal box led the investigators to note that the likelihood of the murder weapon being the found knife was very high. When asked why she did not call for help, Evelyn replied that she was panicked, didn't know what to do, and afraid people would think she harmed Thomas. When the investigator asked if she knew what happened to Thomas's body, Evelyn looked down, was silent for a very long time, then finally said that she didn't know what to do with Thomas when he stopped moving. This led to the central question of the confrontation. Where was Thomas after that? Evelyn initially refused to answer, but when the investigator presented additional data from the stone well, including radar images, reflective light, and sediment analysis, she began to cry. Then, with a choked voice, said that she had taken Thomas to the stone well because she thought no one would find him. This was the first time since 1943 that Evelyn admitted being present at the well area on the night Thomas disappeared, completely breaking her statements over many decades. When asked to specify the exact position in the well, Evelyn pointed to the GPR image and said she remembered placing Thomas on the left side of the well shaft, matching the location where the radar equipment detected the anomaly. Although she did not describe each action in detail, Evelyn's statement that she had dragged Thomas out back in the rain and taken him to the stone well was enough for the investigators to record this as a direct confession related to the body's location. The session minutes clearly stated that Evelyn Carter had admitted to a struggle leading to Thomas Hale's injury, and provided the location of the body in the stone well behind the old house, a piece of information that completely matched the data collected from physical evidence and scene survey. After Evelyn provided the body's location in the stone well and described dragging Thomas there on the rainy night in 1943, the investigation force immediately proceeded with the necessary procedures to excavate the well according to modern forensic standards. Since the well had been filled in over many decades, the excavation had to be conducted carefully to avoid damaging any remaining samples. A forensic team specializing in human remains was dispatched to Blue Ridge, bringing meticulous digging equipment, deep lighting systems, micro-collection tools, and biological sample preservation items. The area around the well was sealed off, barriers erected, and positions marked to ensure no one accessed and affected the scene. The excavation process began by removing the layer of decayed leaves and soft soil covering the well mouth. Then the forensic team carefully scraped each layer of accumulated mud inside. The sediment layers were taken by stratum, each labeled and sent to the lab for relative dating analysis, as well as checking for remaining organic traces. When digging down to the depth where the ground-penetrating radar had recorded an abnormal object, the forensic team discovered material fragments with color and texture different from the surrounding sediment. A technician used a penetrating light to shine obliquely on the surface, and just a few seconds later, the gentle curved outline of a bone structure part appeared. Recognizing this could be part of a human skeleton, the forensic team immediately stopped digging with large tools and switched to manual layer removal, using soft brushes, small brushes, and mini shovels to avoid damaging the sample. As the mud patches were gradually cleared, a portion of the rib cage and arm bone appeared, lying on its side toward the left of the well shaft. This lying direction matched the position Evelyn had indicated in the confrontation, helping the investigation team confirm that what she stated was likely not guesswork. Continuing to clear the mud around, the forensic team found nearly the entire adult human skeleton, including the skull, spine, limb bones, and other small fragments. Although having undergone more than half a century of natural decomposition, the main bone structure was still intact enough for forensic analysis. When examining each bone part in detail, the forensic team paid special attention to the right arm bone, where an unusually deep cut appeared, with sharp-edged signs indicating it had been impacted by a sharp object. This cut matched the size and characteristics of the folding knife blade found in the metal box, strongly reinforcing the likelihood that the bone wound was caused by that knife. Additionally, on some ribs there were longitudinal crack traces, not completely shattered, but enough to indicate strong force impact before, or at the moment of death, consistent with the struggle situation Evelyn described, in which Thomas fell or was pushed onto a hard surface. The skull showed no signs of severe trauma, indicating the cause of death might not involve direct impact to the head. When examining the skeleton's position in the well shaft, the way mud surrounded and natural materials accumulated, the forensic team concluded that the body had been placed in the well without preservation, without significant wrapping cloth or covering. The even mud layer around the bones showed the body had remained in this position for a long time without being moved afterward, consistent with Evelyn's statement that she only dragged Thomas to the well and left him there. The forensic experts then collected bone samples for DNA testing, cross-referencing with DNA samples from Hale family descendants provided earlier. Although the DNA was heavily degraded over time, some genetic segments were sufficient to determine that the skeleton belonged to the Hale bloodline, and based on bone age, estimated height, and joint characteristics, the results authenticated that these were the remains of Thomas Hale. The autopsy results for cause of death showed that the sharp-edged wound on the right arm was most likely a fatal injury penetrating a major blood vessel, leading to rapid blood loss. This matched the dried blood on the handkerchief and chemical traces on the knife blade. The forensic team's final report concluded the skeleton excavated from the bottom of the stone well was that of Thomas Hale, who died from a sharp-edged wound, causing severe blood loss. The bone characteristics and scene data completely matched the evidence discovered at the construction site, as well as Evelyn's admission, creating unity among three sources of information: physical evidence, scene, statement. With this result, the 1943 disappearance was officially determined to be a case of death due to injury caused by a sharp object, and forensic evidence showed the cause of death consistent with the murder weapon recovered in the metal box buried near the old house foundation. After the excavation, results from the stone well confirmed that the skeletal remains were those of Thomas Hale, and the cause of death perfectly matched the sharp-edged wound, consistent with the size of the folding knife found in the metal box. The investigative agency concluded that they possessed all the necessary elements to shift the case from the scope of clarifying historical truth to a complete criminal case file. Evelyn's confession, though not a detailed statement recreating the entire process of inflicting injury, was still a direct admission of her presence during the struggle, witnessing Thomas being injured and transporting the body to the stone well. When combining this admission with the physical evidence, forensic examination, and cross-reference data from 1943, 2000, the police determined that Evelyn's actions met the legal standards to proceed with an arrest for involvement in Thomas's death and the intentional concealment of the body. On the day the arrest warrant was signed, a team of officers was dispatched to Evelyn's residence to execute it. Despite her advanced age, she still had to face legal responsibility for actions committed decades earlier. When the officers read the warrant, Evelyn did not resist, asking only one question: "Is it time now?" A statement recorded in the report, because it indicated an implicit acknowledgement that the new data had ended her period of silence. After being escorted to the station, Evelyn was informed of her rights and provided with an attorney in full accordance with procedure. At the same time, the Fannin County Prosecutor's Office began building the indictment based on three distinct but tightly interconnected groups of evidence. The first group was physical evidence: the folding knife with human blood stains, the handkerchief with DNA matching the Hale bloodline, the watch engraved with characters directly related to Thomas, and the burial location of the metal box right next to the foundation of the house where Thomas and Evelyn once lived. The second group was modern forensic evidence: bone analysis showing a sharp-edged wound, consistent with the blade size, sediment analysis proving the body was placed in the well at a time corresponding to 1943, and GPR results confirming the body's location matched Evelyn's statement. The third group was statements and confession, contradictions in statements from 1943, 2000. The admission of a struggle: the statement that Thomas was no longer moving when she transported the body, and especially her pinpointing the exact area containing the body, something impossible to match unless she was present at the scene. The prosecutor compiled all the data, organizing it into an indictment with three main charges: causing injury leading to death, concealing the body, and obstructing the investigation. However, due to the historical nature of the case, and the fact that much indirect evidence had been eroded by time, the indictment focused most strongly on two pillars: the confession and the match between physical evidence, scene, and forensics. The investigation file was completed and compiled into an official document set, submitted to the Fannin County Court for scheduling a preliminary hearing. Though the events occurred nearly 60 years earlier, the discovery of the body, the weapon, and the confession transformed the 1943 disappearance from ambiguity into a complete criminal case file regarding the death of a man concealed for decades. When the file was transferred to the court, the town of Blue Ridge, which had nearly forgotten the case, suddenly faced the return of an old mystery, now carrying full legal weight, and questions about justice delayed for over half a century. The trial of Evelyn Carter took place at the end of 2000 in the Fannin County Court, attracting attention not only from Blue Ridge residents, but also from regional media, as it was one of the rare cases where the act leading to death occurred nearly 60 years earlier, but was now being tried. The prosecutor opened by presenting the chain of events spanning from 1943 to 2000, emphasizing that this case was not built on speculation, but reconnected through a continuous data structure: the missing person report, unusual traces in the house, the back porch area, Evelyn's contradictory statements, the deadlock leading to file closure, then the unexpected reopening after the metal box was discovered at a 2000 construction site. The prosecutor described in detail how the items buried in the box, a military folding knife with bloodstains, a handkerchief with DNA matching the Hale bloodline, and a watch with engraved characters, demonstrated direct connection to Thomas Hale. He presented the forensic examination results, in which the right arm bone of the remains excavated from the stone well had a sharp-edged cut matching the blade size, creating unity between the weapon, discovery location, and cause of death. The prosecution also reread Evelyn's confession from the confrontation session, emphasizing that she herself pinpointed the exact body location in the well, something no one could do unless present when the body was lowered. After the prosecutor's clear and tight presentation, the defense attorney stood to counter, focusing mainly on the time factor. He argued that the event occurred nearly 60 years ago, and the memory of an 80-year-old person could not be considered accurate basis. The defense claimed Evelyn's confession might have been influenced by psychological pressure from facing images, evidence, and prompting questions, causing her to reimagine the event in a more tragic direction than reality. The attorney also emphasized that the physical evidence, though found near the old house foundation, did not clearly prove Evelyn caused Thomas's death, as third-party intervention or other events faded by time were possible. He argued that relying on degraded DNA, GPR results, and inferences from bone position could lead to uncertain conclusions. Additionally, the defense questioned whether a wartime woman, petite and with no history of violence, could drag an adult man's body to the stone well, especially in heavy rain conditions. The prosecution immediately rebutted, presenting 1943 records showing Evelyn had stated many details affirming she did not leave the house at night and did not go near the well, but by 2000, her statement shifted to not remembering clearly. The prosecution argued that age-related memory decline does not produce such systematic contradictions. On the contrary, the contradictions showed a clear trend. Evelyn changed her statements when new evidence emerged, especially evidence she could not reasonably explain. When the jury heard this part, they were provided with a comparison table of each contradiction between 1943 and 2000 statements. Next, the prosecution presented expert opinions from the forensic team. The force needed to move the body over wet ground did not exceed an adult's strength, especially with natural slope terrain toward the well. Sediment evidence showed the body was lowered into the well in an uncovered state, matching Evelyn's description. The jury spent time carefully analyzing the physical evidence. They reviewed radar images, bone samples, fracture positions, correlations between depth, decomposition level, and cut analysis on the arm bone. The forensic expert affirmed this was not an accidental injury, but caused by a sharp object with a long, thin blade, corresponding to the found folding knife. The jury also examined the map of the metal box burial location. The box appearing in an area almost untouched since 1943 led them to assess that the evidence was buried before the old house was demolished, meaning the action occurred at a time when only Evelyn and Thomas lived there. Finally, the jury considered the confession. Though the defense attorney tried to prove the admission could be influenced by emotional factors, the jury members noted that Evelyn provided the exact body location before police released GPR images, showing she could not have guessed correctly by chance. After evaluating all physical evidence, scientific data, historical statements, and confession, the jury reached the conclusion that the evidence chain was tightly linked, consistent, and of sufficient legal value. The trial entered the deliberation phase, with the assessment that cause of death, physical evidence, scientific data, and confession formed an undeniable structure of truth. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom in the tense silence of all present. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the room became completely quiet, as if the 60 years of the case were compressed into that single moment. Based on the recovered physical evidence, modern forensic examination, sediment evidence, cross-comparison of statements across 2 periods, and the defendant's confession, the court declared Evelyn Carter guilty of second-degree murder under Georgia criminal law, while determining that concealing the body and burying evidence in the metal box contributed to prolonging the investigation for nearly 6 decades. Given the defendant's advanced age, the sentence did not carry deterrent meaning in the usual sense, but served to establish the truth, ending a disappearance that had haunted the town of Blue Ridge since 1943. The court sentenced 20 years in prison, emphasizing that though time had changed many things, legal responsibility for a human life does not disappear. Evelyn quietly nodded, showing no strong reaction, saying only a short sentence before being led out of the courtroom. "I knew this day would come." After the verdict, the Fannin County Investigative Office officially announced that the disappearance of Thomas Hale, once classified as missing without clear cause, then moved to cold case status, was now closed with full legal conclusion. In the summary session, investigators presented that the 57-year case was not due to lack of effort by the 1943 force, but because of era limitations in technology, equipment, and examination methods. Without DNA, without ground-penetrating radar, without molecular trace analysis capability, the investigators then had to stop at suspicion level without physical evidence to proceed further. The stone well, where the body was hidden, had traces erased by heavy rain, and with its deep, narrow structure and sediment fill, the 1943 search team had no chance to access it. Additionally, the metal box containing the weapon, handkerchief, and watch buried next to the house foundation made the evidence disappear from sight for half a century, breaking all leads that could have guided the force then to the body location. In the final report, the investigative team emphasized that the case's revival in 2000 succeeded only through the combination of 3 factors: the accidental discovery of the metal box at the construction site, modern forensic science advancements, and consistent cross-referencing between physical evidence, statements, and scene data. This is clear proof of forensics' power in reviving files thought to have sunk into the past. When the case was officially closed, the file was stamped complete and moved to closed homicide status, and the town of Blue Ridge entered a new chapter in its collective memory. The disappearance that had been an unanswered question across generations now had a clear conclusion, though belated but necessary for truth and for the Hale family, who finally received an answer after 57 years of waiting. The story of the Thomas Hale case, clarified after 57 years thanks to buried evidence, modern forensic technology, and persistence in reopening the file, offers many valuable lessons for American life today. Where missing persons cases, domestic violence, and cold cases remain serious social issues. First, the detail of the metal box accidentally discovered at a construction site shows that truth sometimes lies in the smallest things that people, years ago, lacked technology or conditions to uncover. This reminds us that preserving files, evidence, and data, even for old cases, is extremely important. Many law enforcement agencies in the United States today have invested more in digitizing files and long-term evidence preservation precisely because of cases like Thomas Hale, where justice was served thanks to seemingly useless data. Additionally, Evelyn's story reflects a painful reality in American society. Many domestic violence cases are not recognized at the time, leading to tragic outcomes. The disarray signs in the house, inconsistent statements, and Thomas's disappearance right after a tense rainy night, all were signals that the community, neighbors, or authorities need to be more sensitive to detect in modern life. This case emphasizes the importance of early reporting of dangerous behavior, abnormal situations, or signs of domestic violence, as many regrettable deaths could be prevented if the community acts in time. Finally, the 2000 forensic technology, such as DNA testing, GPR, and sediment analysis, shows that science can become a tool to reclaim justice even after decades. In today's American context, with the development of artificial intelligence technology, big data analysis, and biometric identification systems, The public and authorities need to continue investing in forensics so that every victim, even missing for decades, still has a chance to regain their voice. Thank you for following to the end of the journey in solving a case thought to be buried for nearly 6 decades. If you want to continue accompanying stories that restore voices to victims, please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we continue to restore truth from files thought to be dormant.